Hello and welcome to Maritain Musings. I'm Dr. Matthew Minard here on behalf of the American Maritain Association. Today, very happily with my friend, Father Cajetan Cuddy, who is an assistant professor of dogmatic and moral theology at the Dominican House of Studies in Washington, D.C. We're going to be talking today about the relationship between Jacques Maritain and Reginald Garrigou-Lagrange, a Dominican who lived in the late 19th century, but mostly then in the 20th century, dying in the 1960s. And so I just want to first of all, of course, begin by thanking you, Father Cuddy, for being here with us today.
It's always a pleasure to speak with you, Dr. Minard, and to support the AMA.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, you were present. Father Cuddy was present as one of our speakers at a recent conference as well. So he's overlapped on and off with us, as many Dominicans have, not just Father Garrigou-Lagrange, but many others. Maybe at the level of ice-breaking for our readership, for instance, among the esteemed members of your province would be Father Farrell, correct? William, right? It's William, right? My mind has stopped. Walter Farrell. And there's a picture of Father Farrell and Jacques Maritain together at the house, correct?
Seated in front of a desk, yes.
And very appropriate to the Frenchman, there are 6, 7 open packs of cigarettes just littered across the table. And so probably
and one lit one within Jacques' hands.
Yeah, one in his hands.
And notice the Dominican, he's just watching, but yeah.
Yeah, that's right. But, so I don't know who they're talking to. Maybe everyone's smoking, right? Because a lot of people smoked during those days. Or maybe Jacques smoked them all because he was a Frenchman. So in any event, all right, lightheartedness aside, so our viewership, we're not going to cover the whole relationship. It's very complex. It's very detailed. It's a very important point of contact. But if nothing else, I'd like to break the ice about the relationship between Maritain and Garrigou-Lagrange. We can land their names in a more American register if we want to do that with how we pronounce them, just to be clear as well. So it may surprise some people who are just stumbling in to this recording to even think of the two being together. Those who might know something more of Jacques' writings know, of course, the fact that he heavily cites Garrigou-Lagrange, but they have a certain narrative that they drifted apart and Maritain became a progressive, concerned only with political things later on in his life. And so they just may not understand the relationship between them. And it's a relationship that's both personal and speculative, because it's interesting, because in some ways the speculative relationship begins before the personal, even though they had a time of overlap at the Sorbonne in Paris. They didn't really know each other, except that, as you know, Father Garrigou is there for his studies, and he's writing back to Father Ambrose Gardet, about this young Bergsonian philosopher who's, giving some kind of talk about, the sort of riding the crest of freedom. I mean, it's this very Bergsonian kind of language that's recounted in the letter. And he refers to him as, this young man with a shock of hair, this young Slav. And someone
and a young girl that's always following him that looks like his sister. That's what Garrigou thought.
And that's probably, she was a Slav. So it was probably, his wife that, made him think this. There's a certain dramatic person to Maritain. Apparently, not Gerald Phelan, Pegus. It was either Phelan or Pegus once said to a mutual contact that you and I have, much older scholar, that Maritain couldn't go out without 4 scarves on. Right. So he was always dramatic. They actually, of course, their speculative training ends up being the same. It's funny enough, somewhat even connected with some of the same people in the order, but they were not connected as though Maritain was reading after his conversion, Garrigou, and then becoming a certain kind of Thomist. He said they re-meet sort of under not only the aegis of neo-scholasticism, but the reception of Thomas through your order's tradition of reading and living their Thomism. So it would probably be good just to maybe, to the degree we can, give an overview of their relationship, and we'll be sort of at a very high level. And I'll let you decide what you want to do speculatively and personally. Probably good that we mentioned the role that Garrigou played preaching at the Thomist circles. But outside that, I don't have a desired narrative, right? Because I've probably told this narrative online myself already. So this is not about me just getting to spout my own narrative over and over, but rather have you bring something new to the discussion. So why don't you, at least lead our banter in that direction?
Well, since you've kindly introduced it vis-a-vis the religious connections, as Jacques and Raissa became Catholic and then entered deeply into Catholicism, you can see 3 different circles of influence. And of course, there's Léon Blois, who was a very, very interesting and insightful lay Catholic author. And of course, he was profoundly important for Jacques and Raissa and their early conversion, their early formation in the Catholic faith and culture. And then they met, as I say this with smile for you, having knowing your affection and past with the Benedictines, to the Benedictine order and Dom Dalat and all of the people associated with the Benedictine renewal that was happening. And so they became Benedictine oblates and imbibed in a lay formality according to the properly proportioned lay state, Benedictine spirituality, as we would say today. And then through the Benedictines, they met Dominican, Humbert Clarissac, we would say Humbert Clarissac. And as you know, Clarissac became for them very much of a spiritual father and guide. And he lived with them. And as you know, Raissa would often remember fondly that when Clarissac, who was hiding out because of the turmoil in Europe at the time with some religious orders, he would stay with him. Father Clarissac would stay with him. And she said, I can still remember hearing him sing the office kind of by himself in the room where he stayed. And so with Father Clarissac, who was not a high theologian, he was more of a known preacher. He wrote interesting essays on St. Dominic and the church. And he died young. But what Clarissac gave them as not a speculative Thomist, but let's say a religious Thomist, a man who in every aspect of life lived by Thomistic principles applied extensively. And when you read Jacques' notebooks and even Raissa's memoirs about their early lives, it's very clear that Clarissac played an influence on kind of Jacques' speculative research interests early on. I know you and I both, you read his early work, and for a young philosopher, albeit maybe a little more polemical than you might find later on, but his book, The Three Reformers, and then The Dream of Descartes, remarkably insightful, speculative engagements, but they're clearly attuned to the spiritual implications of things. So I would say that when I think of it, here I'm not offering a narrative so much as categories, that it was through their Catholic connection to Léon Bois, and then to the Benedictines, and then to the Dominicans, and you have Clarissac. And then because the Dominican order, even though she was quite large at that time, everyone knows each other. And so very soon, as you have said, Dr. Miner, they reconnect with Garrigou. And Garrigou was a Dominican like Clarissac, but Garrigou did have, like Maritain, the Thomistic principial formality that extended to everything. And so in my view, that is the progression, that they discovered Thomas for the right reason, Jacques and Raissa, namely, they wanted to know and to love God. They wanted it for spiritual reasons. And once they came to St. Thomas, never losing that final causality, they entered sublimely into the speculative order, but never losing resolutional movements into the practical and the spiritual. And Garrigou-Lagrange was right there with them and having a great concern about that. And so this was not just friendship between Garrigou and the Maritains, as you have pointed out, but then they formalized it with the Thomistic circles that they began at their home, so formalized that we have that almost like a regula vitae, like that Raissa wrote that they have to follow, and all the members. And it was not just speculative people, it was artists, musicians, poets, philosophers, theologians, seminarians, future priests like Yves Congar. And Garrigou for early on was kind of the chaplain of that. So he would give a lecture, but that would draw out the spiritual implications. And so for me, like when I think of Garrigou and Maritain, I think of the very early 20th century, that image that Jacques recalls in his notebooks of Raissa, when one of her moments of weakness, they're walking down, pushing her in the wheelchair, and Jacques just walking next to them. And you can see Garrigou in his habit, probably has the black beanie on that he was wont to wear. Raissa's probably wrapped up more. She always had tons of blankets on like a mummy. And then there's Jacques, the very dignified Frenchman, walking with them in like a beautiful path of France. For me, that's Jacques Maritain and Garrigou, friends in God, talking to God and about God. And all of the other things which we can get into, of course, those are ancillary to their fundamental identity in those who cherche le Seigneur, look for the Lord, search for the Lord. Yeah.
Well, that's a great, and I think that's probably the most essential, because it's not just narrative, right? I mean, the most essential way there to cut the data of their the deepest strands of their friendship. I mean, that even later on in a period of somewhat estrangement, not pure estrangement, but partial estrangement, that still, I think, remained. So there's a certain care that the aged Garrigou still has, above all, I mean, in the Lord, and as fellow Catholics, and I mean, it's a deep affection and shared grace that comes through, I guess, is what I'm saying. You'll see, when Journet writes to Maritain about having seen, Le Père Garrigou when maybe Journet was passing through Rome, the sense that, he wants to check in on Maritain, right? There's a certain pain because of the issues regarding political philosophy and things of that sort. And although they were in touch, we may or may not talk about that, especially late in life. They're less in touch, and yet he still has this concern for, like, how is this friend in whom I've walked about, because we've shared, I mean, not just the formality, but really in a certain sense, I mean, sharing the formality of faith, hope, and charity. I mean, we've shared one in the same life by different participations. And so it's important to see that, because then it's easy to get caught in the intellectual stuff, right? Because then we start going into I'll be like gesturing in this direction for Jacques and in this direction for Garrigou, because it's where they are on my shelves. So if, Garrigou's behind me, he's not standing over my shoulder. His books are back there. Right. That's, it's easy to sort of get lost there and start talking about, okay, now what was their intellectual overlap with regard to the Thomist school, and you start kind of getting there. Yeah. Was there a thought you wanted to articulate there, or?
No, I think it's you see it. So, and Jacques is very touching. After Garrigou's died, in the notebooks he talks, Jacques just says, this is a man who was most ignorant of the ways of the world with a great simplicity. And he says, and I miss him. And he says, and I pray to him as one of the saints in heaven. I mean, that, as you say, that shows what their friendship was. It wasn't just, hey, we're two really smart guys that can get a lot of stuff done. No, it really was a Godward unity. It was unity in the objective of God. God is formal object. God is material object. And it's only then, you mentioned the speculative coherence. It's so evident that Garrigou and Jacques were friends and collaborators on the speculative level because of this deeper connection that they had. But virtually every other page of Maritain, when he's doing his kind of straight Thomism, he's referring, look, check out Garrigou said this. He has a good point here. Mm-hmm. And then you read Garrigou and it's like, for more on this, like if you want to see this unpacked, check out. And it's usually, the three ages, or the 3 degrees of knowledge, like the distinguish or to unite. They're always kind of saying, like, this, my colleague, Maritain and Garrigou, has handled this. I'm not going to say everything they said because I don't have to. They did. Check it. And it's like every other page, they're pointing to different essays, different books.
Yeah. And you definitely have the sense of maybe more dependence in a certain way from Maritain to Garrigou. But I mean, nonetheless, and I'm not undermining what you said. I think you'd agree with that. You may be just playing your hand gently to the Maritain feel. No, but it's striking at times. Like, so just because there are things I've been working on recently, when Garrigou develops that whole bit about the language of the mystics, he's picking up something right out of Maritain. He's just picking the ball up out of the degrees of knowledge. Or in those debates over natural and even then the possibility of supernatural mysticism outside the church, and to what degree is that possible, right? There are striking positions that are taken by Garrigou, but except they're very limited. Like, it's so rare that you're going to have spiritual perfection in the church. So what are we going to even expect by those who by a special grace through the righteous on the outside, in a very inchoate way, have the formality of grace present in voto? Like, to what degree is like, you're watching me like you're nervous.
No.
To what degree is spiritual experience even possible here? And there were some like Massignon and others, I think, who were really trying to go look in Sufism and other things for what would be a legitimate supernatural experience. Well, Maritain kind of lays out the epistemological possibilities and then just delimits them immensely. And Garrigou just takes his delimitations, which was very striking to me. And they're super delimited. I mean, they're incredibly conservative, the delimitations. So I'd have to look and see if the later Maritain loosens it, right? But this is sort of in the 20s and 30s when these discussions are going on. I mean, that's striking to see it used. I was actually a little bit surprised whenever I realized what Garrigou was tracing as he delimited it. Like, basically when he put the brakes on, he said, yeah, this is possible because of what we have to hold about, those who for no fault of their own do not know the message of faith. Right, there's a development, I think, doctrinally that's already present in the tradition, that you can't just act as though it's just the natural law that's present in those people, because otherwise you basically float off the edge of history without grace and then somehow get saved at the end. You know what I'm talking about, right, with the idea of the salvation of pagans. So that Garrigou legitimately deals with it. But then whenever I look at his delimitations, I realized, oh, geez, those stringent delimitations are actually the exact same ones that Maritain at this time in his career had. So just like on these kind of very exploratory and engaged sort of questions that they're dealing with each other. Or like we were talking about the age and intellect recently, where like Garrigou just sort of like offhandedly talks about like the other role of the agent intellect. And I don't know which one's influencing each other, but they're both basically developing at the same time a kind of more capacious view of the role of the agent intellect. And guess what they're both doing is pulling from the tradition, which might be a good segue, unless you want to, in the segue, you can correct the errors of Minard. They're the things that you don't want to be associated with from Minard. What would you say? What do you want to say about like the significant points of speculative connection? Because I think it's important for people to see this, because a lot of lay philosophers tend to think, there's whoever they think of as the theologians kind of from that era. And there's a kind of mixture of what they think about who those are, right? They may be thinking Mercier and Sheen or something like that. You know what I mean? Let alone not the people we would think of as the Thomists of that era. But and then on the other hand, they'll say, Gilson and Maritain. And it drives me nuts because that's such a weird division, right? It makes no sense. And so maybe there's something you want to say about the speculative connections then between the men, because that's a really important way to understand then the kind of next step from that spiritual core, their, for lack of better terms, their Thomism.
Yes, and so that's you highlight a very significant principal point in the topic that we're discussing, Maritain and Garrigou, because so spiritually and most significantly, they're oriented to and around God. And what makes their speculative work so coherent, mutually referential, mutually verifying, is because Jacques Maritain is not doing Jacques Maritain and Garrigou-Lagrange is not doing Garrigou. They've inherited and received a tradition of principles. And Garrigou got this, of course, from the Dominican order, because at that time, it was written into the constitutions that every Dominican had to be a Thomist. That didn't just adhere to, this is said explicitly in the constitutions of the time, not just what Thomas himself said, but also the language and categories and principles of the Thomist tradition. So Garrigou got it there. Now, Maritain, in his, let's call it formation with Clarissac, but then later with another spiritual director from the Dominican order that came along, who was nearly blind, of course, Maritain would read to him John of St. Thomas, because this is what the old blind Dominican wanted to hear after, reciting the office and praying the rosary. And so in terms of context, that spiritual dynamism that drove them both led them not just to Aquinas and not just to the speculative, but to the speculative first principles of the Thomist tradition. And this, I think, is what can explain both the unity of Maritain and Garrigou. Namely, they fundamentally shared and never negated the absolute and first principles, both supernatural, spiritual, the articles of faith, but also then philosophical, the real distinctions of potency and act, form and matter, essence, existence. And so that fundamental, speculative, defining, unique, peculiar, namely Thomistic, those Thomistic convictions account for their unity and for their perspicacious, sapiential engagement in the middle period, let's say, of their friendship and collaboration, when they, especially Maritain here, Garrigou's much more the cleric, the religious, and the priest. He'll look down the road towards implications of society and other things, but he's always attuned to philosophy and theology. But Maritain is a man in the world. He'll apply the first principles to everything under the sun. It's remarkable. And that's why Garrigou said, go Jacques, go Jacques, go Jacques. Like let's do art. Oh, good. Let's do this. Let's do that. Let's do this. Let's do that. Let's do culture. Let's do literature. And his letters, even more so, you see it because he's just talking. And so I think that shared speculative unity that they received from the Thomist tradition enabled them to collaborate in such a way that there is parallel, but they could appreciate each other's strengths and works, and specifically Maritain's ability to, I hate to use the phrase, but be a public intellectual, but not just public and not just intellectual, but wise. And then finally, what's interesting is I think also their differences, which come up at the end, also emerged not because they began to have different first principles, but because they began to have different differences in how you would deploy or apply or extend the principles to specific questions. So even here, with differences towards the end of their respective lives, first principles can also account for where they were really distinct from each other in kind of disagreed. And so this is where you and I deeply believe and feel, for spiritual reasons as well as intellectual, that Thomism and Thomist tradition is not just a historical thing. It's not about a guy. If that were the case, the Catholic Church would have to be called Thomist because she has endorsed the guy. But of course, the Catholic Church is not Thomist. She has no proper philosophy. First principles are what account for making one a Thomist, specifically the first principles, the three real distinctions of potency, act, essence, existence, form, and matter, as well as being and non-being. Hopefully we could consider that as well.
Yeah. Even if some of us look down the line at the implications of non-being.
That's right. That's right.
This is insider.
That's right. No, I know. You're a very special
listening.
man. That's why. And I tell you, like Jacques, go, Dr. Miner, go. Run down there. Let me know what you find. No,
it's good for like in the middle of things. Like it keeps it light. But yeah, this is
no. You know. You please go ahead, pick
no,
up the ball.
I mean, people can just see this is something out of like John Dealey I picked up about like the implications of kind of misknowing where the bounds of non-being actually are in our experience. What do we call non-being? Although Father Cuddy once told me I'm an expert in non-being because I did my dissertation on second intentions, which are a kind of non-being.
No, I said you're an expert in things that don't technically exist, like outside exist subsystem or something like that. Yeah, yeah. But I love it. Yeah. That was only playfully. I'm a big believer in the importance of second intentions.
For anyone who's watching the chiasmus of the podcast, this is the hidden meaning is right here. And now we're making
this is every day
exoteric. Well, we're making exoteric the esoteric narrative about second intentions. No, I think it's a good way to put it. There's a tendency I even have, and I don't know if it's, the era I was trained in, the place I was trained in. People are reading, of course, MacIntyre, that I'll tend to talk about them as drawing from the same tradition. And that leads to something you and I are personally often very averse to, thinking of it just in terms of sources, right? I mean, there's a certain truth, right? Because they're both going to take seriously John of St. Thomas, or less so Capreolus, they just don't cite him as much, or the Salamanca Carmelites, or Billuart, or most importantly, John of St. Thomas. But it's of course, the structure of principles and conclusions argued for in those texts that are what unite them. Right. And I know that sounds like some people are going to say this is the typical thing we talk about, but it's important to see it because it's not like they're in a certain subaltern Republic of Thomism talking over here,
Yes. And that's precisely why they could talk about things that neither Thomas nor John of St. Thomas had talked about.
Mm-hmm.
Because they could apply those same principles to new questions or different questions. So that's our thing. The concern with Garrigou, and see, you've got me going now on my shtick. See, Dr. Meyer's very clever. He goes, if we just get him going on this, he'll become very animated, It's after lunch, I'm half asleep, and now he's got me going.
I got him going.
That we're not, the reason why we, Dr. Meyer and I, and our friends and colleagues that are interested in similar things is, do we love sources? Sure. The Bible supremely, patristic magisterial texts, absolutely. Thomas himself, but those are all discrete things that are physically, temporally, and discretely limited when life and reality has a panoply of different things that first principles apply to. So if you follow a principial method, for lack of a better word, in your contemplation, in your scientific and sapiential judgments, which are distinct, as you, Dr. Meyer, have reminded us very well in your essay, your fine essay, Wisdom Be Attentive from Nova et Vetera a few years ago. Very important essay, and one that I refer to quite often. In fact, I did so, I think, twice this week to different people. Sapiential and scientific judgments, we are enabled to address things in a way that is not just quoting Thomas or the Thomists. Texts by nature are discrete. Principles by nature are transcendental and universal, and therefore nothing escapes a transcendental or a universal. Therefore, a principle is always relevant no matter what we deal with. Some of the modern ethical, moral, political, societal, and even doctrinal questions, Garrigou-Lagrange, John of St. Thomas, Banyas, Maritain, and the apostles might not even have ever thought would come up. And so you're not going to find it in their writings, but the principles are there in all of their writings. Therefore, we can apply the principles today. So our point is not just beating down sources. It's saying that what do you get in the sources? It's principles that reside outside the sources.
Yeah. And then now there's like where we got multiple republics who might have stumbled in here. So there are those who are like, they find a way to do this everywhere they go. But it's so important because I think you miss, and this is a way to come back, because it's something you said made me think of this in Garrigou. So I'm going to tell you a story that I don't know if I told you this ever or not. When I was working on the editing for De Revelazione, what did we call it? On Divine Revelation, I guess, is what we called it with Emmaus. The person who was doing the translation review for the first volume, I was just sort of talking to him. And at a certain point, I just said, I saw a wrinkle in what he was saying to me. And I said, do you consider this guy a Thomist? Garrigou, that is. And I was curious because we shared a certain affection for Tim Noon, and there's a certain way these guys who have a PIMS, a Pontifical Institute sort of outlook, right? They're very historically siloed, right? He's doing something different there. He's therefore not Thomisien. He's not Thomas, right? At least. And the guy said, "Oh no. I consider him he's a priest he's teaching in Rome in the early 20th century, for whom Thomas is just the central reference point." Now, this was his way of saying in a different way, in a way that probably misses all the points we're making. That even where Garrigou, even where you have that sense of sort of he's citing the tradition a lot, right? He's clearly doing something that's new. There is no treatise on divine revelation that exists in the Summa Theologiae, in the Ordo Scientiae that is laid out there, right? Now, he's the inheritor of a tradition, right? Especially, I think, most closely Zigliara. Zigliara's Propedeutic is the closest structural thing for that text. But that's just a way that the question has been worked over because of rationalism, right? And so you have what is a kind of new, it's a new thing, even though it's within the same principle structure, right? And I think something similar can be said along the lines for the spiritual theology stuff as well. I think it floats around throughout lots of other places too, that you sense the idea of a living intellect here. And I think people would just be surprised to hear that that's like a parallel you can draw with Maritain and him. They're doing it in different modalities because one is a layman and one is a cleric, one's teaching at Rome and one's doing all of his random stuff. But yeah, that in the end, it actually creates a kind of way of being a thinker that's more like than different for whatever might be the conclusions that were drawn, on the question of especially some of the church state stuff. But even, some of the other issues too. I don't think Garrigou could ever travel as far as Maritain because, there's just that. Maybe it is something with the lay. I don't know. There's definitely going to be a cleric teaching in Rome is a very different thing, what you're going to be focusing on and comfortable doing.
Cloistered living affects your thought in a way. It's true. No, I think there is a difference there. But, and what they have in common, it makes it much more interesting and much more useful. That's kind of that's why we're still, the fact that you and I here in the year 2025 are having a conversation about, to use what many people would classify us as discussing, two dead old guys from Europe. The fact that we're still talking about them, it shows that they tapped into something which is beyond
their time.
Yeah, their time. And they're even in some cases, their distinct concerns, because they were applying principles, making judgments, both scientific and sapiential, to different questions. And it's that formality, which is why publishers can't keep Thomas on the shelf. It's fascinating. If we had gone back to 1957 and looked and whispered, "Hey, you guys know who's going to be the big seller in 70 years? Who? Garrigou-Lagrange." They'd been like, "Give me a break."
Yeah, or imagine
today,
in 1970, if you said that there was going to be such an online interest in, guess what? Here's what the 25-year-olds are going to be doing. They're going to be using the new AI technology to basically take all of the old Baroque commentators and try and translate them. Like, no one would have believed that.
No one would believe it.
Yeah.
And then you saw, the other who's kind of a little older than they, and one of my heroes, the one who really shaped my own thinking in a profoundly deep way early on, Gallus Manser, the Swiss Dominican. This is a guy everyone forgot about, very few had heard of, because he wrote in German his book, The Essence of Thomism. And yet, I believe you told me you put a tweet on Twitter just saying that the book is out, and you got thousands of people wanting, where is it? Where can I get it? Emmaus Academic, Amazon,
It's like, I put up cryptic things hoping that they'll be like, people be like, what's the crazy man talking about? And yeah, I mentioned Gallus Manser, who was influential on Garrigou. I'm trying to think actually if it was ever cited by Maritain, because Maritain knew German because he translated something by Driesch. But it got 20,000 shares or something at the last time I bothered even checking. But yeah, it was like almost shocked. I thought, well, this is good for the publisher. This is good for for Emmaus.
And more than Manser, Garrigou, or Maritain, it shows that all three of them were about principles, and that's why they have perennial value.
Yeah, that's you landed it. So there. that section has now come to a close. And if we had sponsors, we would be hearing from them now, but we don't, because we don't roll that way. With
But
the
we'd
AMA.
like them. If you'd like to sponsor the AMA, we would be very happy to hear from you.
Happy. Yeah,
Dove soap, we'll sponsor you. Yeah.
So, there's some kind of the Greek soap that I have to use because it doesn't bother me. So I get to smell like olives, which is just a great smell, like to smell like you were in an olive press. All right, so that's we've come to the middle. This is a much more lighthearted interaction. So we're actually sort of, for your own reference, and anyone who's listened to these knows that I do the outline ahead of time. So we're just going to be in that last part about the more specific and maybe spicier topics, because we've kind of covered, I think, what we were going to try to do for 1, 2, and 3. There are many things that could be left out. That's other discussions, you know what I mean? That can be handled some other day, because this is not a comprehensive podcast. And so kind of you landed it, put a nice bow on it. So I like to end with something spicier, ask your interviewer if they wrote a book, like ask them the controversial question about it. Well, here it's the controversial questions underneath the surface. So I think we need to first broach openly the thing that's been in the background since the beginning, the political stuff, right? Certain narratives that's around the time of the giving of the lectures that are integral humanism in the 1980s. It's in the midst of the Spanish Civil War, the gradual unfolding of the Second World War, the émigré experience in America, right? The experience of Vichy, and then also too the post-war experience of the CDF concerns about church-state issues, not really just in Maritain, but also in people like Congar and others that float in the background here. One of the things that doesn't, and listeners can go see the talk I had recently on here with Taylor Patrick O'Neill. The Person of the Common Good controversy doesn't, because actually the two of them, even in the midst of sort of their differences after the Spanish Civil War and the Second World War, they actually had talked about the issues between Maritain and Deconic, and Garrigou reviewed the articles that were in Revue Thomiste. He looked over them for Jacques whenever he was in Rome as ambassador, and he was actually, other than a few small points, quite fine with how it was articulated. And he even used certain elements of it because it came from a shared tradition from Marie Benoit Schwalm that Maritain used as well. So there's a certain shared way of articulating at least elements of the indirect subordination structure of church and state in that one regard, with regard to the common good there. But those three, the Spanish Civil War, the experience of World War II, which I'm going to keep as a whole thing, right? I mean, yeah, that's obviously the issue of Vichy, but kind of broadly then the experience of conservative clerics in Europe versus those who were immediately set against Vichy, and then gradually others were. It's very good to be clear here, because the listener might come in. It's entirely clear that Garrigou never held water for any of the anti-Semitism. So I can say that very clearly. So if you're here to raise that issue, be gone, because that's dishonest. It has mostly to do with the experience of which republic would it have been at the turn of the century?
I think
anti-clerical laws at the beginning of the
anti-clerical
century.
laws. Yes, that's what's governing Garrigou. It's very clearly that's what's governing Garrigou.
Exactly. Yeah, and others, a lot, not all, because there's always you can drag the net of humanity over the bottom of a lot of tires.
But for Garrigou, that's what's making him make his judgments, and Maritain's trying to step back, for better or for worse, and say, let's look at the whole theoretical big picture.
Yeah, exactly. And then kind of related to that becomes, but it's not the same, church-state issues in the late 40s into the 50s and the CDF. So those three things are kind of known as separating Maritain and Garrigou, and in some ways placing Maritain and Journet closer together. What are how do you approach it? Because you're going to approach it differently than I do, just because we've thought about it differently, right?
Yeah. So I've always, to be honest, so this is where I'm happy to be having this conversation with you, because from the Maritain side of it, you have really gotten into the weeds and into the jungle with Maritain on these things. And as I recall, not to out you, but there are a few points where, as much as you love and have a devotion to Maritain, you're like, this is very wrong and dangerous. So you have a very nuanced view about Maritain. Some of the things.
I thread a needle, and I go back and forth on it, but I get very concerned about the appropriate articulation of church-state matters in him. My current thing is, was it done through Journet? I'm not, I'm not sure, but that's basically the road that I have to travel in my soul. Is that this chapter 6 of the first volume of legacies basically does the work that Maritain never did to to clean himself up with regard to Immortality Dei, but I still have potential critical reservations about how to articulate the necessary. It's a question of ecclesiology, right? Is what this is. That's how I think of it, at least.
Yes.
The external relationship of the church to the state. One of the strengths that actually both of them share, Garrigou and Maritain, is that they take seriously what's coming out of Torquemada as well as others then in our tradition, and also admittedly Bellarmine, even though they're not taking it necessarily from the Bellarmine direction, the indirect authority of the church over the state. They both drive it in a very real way that takes seriously that it's indirect and they don't emphasize the instrumentalization of the polis by the church as a central datum, right? Like there's maybe a way in which that can be exercised, and Journet talks about that juridical power of the church over the state in that regard. But Garrigou even emphasizes, the indirect nature of that subordination structure. And so that's the principial layer where it's fine. It's just, I get nervous. I get nervous in the idea of a kind of secular, the way that Maritain talks about secular Christendom. I get the idea of like the differences between political orders, and yet there's something in there that it just worries me. Like there's one too many steps being given to a liberal view of the politics. So sorry, you made me in front of my people to get honest about myself, because you did out me. So you just went into that closet and you just drug me out of that closet. But please, Father, please continue.
No, and I think, but this is exactly why I invited this, and you walked right through. As I didn't take much of bait for you to do that, as you didn't take much bait for me earlier to do what I did, which is wonderful.
Take a lot of bait.
But in their defense, or rather in their explanation, or as the French would say, their explication, what we consider today ecclesiology in church and state questions, that does have, of course, that didn't begin in the early 20th century, late 19th, but they're kind of, in its modern expression, wading into almost like a new discipline, because the whole world was changing. I mean, what's hard for people in our 40s today to appreciate without doing a lot of reading and study and talking to old, wise people who lived through it, just how deeply changed the world was after World War I and World War II. Because you had religious structures, even while remaining distinct from certain regimes of kings and rulers. But the pre-World Wars world was different than it was now, and even in the midst of it when Garrigou and Maritain were living. And so when the church begins to see that you still had the Vatican City State, you still had, Catholic monarchs. You still had non-Catholic monarchs. I mean, how many monarchs do we have now? So in their defense, Maritain and Garrigou are both trying to do the work of the wise man, sapientis est ordinare, in a very moving, changing, dynamic period. And so this is where, even though I, like you, would have great reservations before some of Maritain's proposals, and one could even look at Garrigou and say, maybe Garrigou was too intransigent and stubborn when he should have been open to more changes, not in their defense, because that makes it sound negative, but to explain this. They didn't have Lumen Gentium yet. They didn't have Nostra Aetate. The world, how they were living in a time when people didn't know what the world was going to look like. And so you could see the two tendencies. One, the kind of the political conservatism of Garrigou being an understandable reaction to a vastly changing world. And you could see Maritain maybe having a little bit more clarity because he's living in the world and saying, no, Father Garrigou, things are different and they ain't never going back.
Yeah.
So what do we do?
Not just reaction, but it was, it was a not completely, it's not a completely wrong lens for interpreting the data. That's all. Because I'm going to say, because it's not just pure reaction. I think like if you read like his thing about the subordination of the state to the human person's perfection, or whatever, that article that's in the Philosophizing in Faith volume that I translated, I mean, you have the sense that there's not a pure reactionary stance here, right? And that's what actually makes him different than like some of the really conservative critics of Maritain, where he defends Maritain, not on Maritain's conclusions, but yet sort of seeing the honesty of, basically, he wouldn't have put it the way you put it, but like he's espying something of the honesty of Maritain, thinking through the issues that he's not. Lamennais, for instance. This isn't French liberalism of a century earlier.
Yes, it was a very complex time. And And it's very interesting. I mean, you can look at different figures, the ressourcement, the Thomists, the revisionists, the conservatives, the Nouvelle Théologie, the Toulouse, Fourvière. But one thing we got to say is, well, the reason why the 20th century is so interesting, it's one of the most tumultuous periods on all levels of reality, like social, political, ecclesial, familial, sexual revolution,
Spiritual. I mean,
spiritual.
yeah.
And so what we're talking about, no wonder why it says, to use your word, in the outline. I was reading, Dr. Minard, to our listeners, kindly sent me the outline a couple of days ago, and I'm scrolling through it, and he says, now to get a little more spicy, I said, that's a very Minardian word. But the reason why it is so spicy is that the whole 20th century was spicy. Go ahead, sorry.
Oh.
Piquant, there we go. Ça c'est vrai, oui, c'est ça. C'est piquant.
But it was all spicy. That's a good way to put it. Have you ever read Berdyaev's A New Middle Ages?
No.
Yeah, I wonder, it's like as I read it, because, he and Maritain were interacting a lot. We had a guest on here, Anna Siljak, made me get a couple books by Berdyaev, which is sometimes, I mean, that post-Soloviev stuff in the Russian world is sometimes like enough to make your eyes go like they're going here. For those of you who are seeing the video, at least you see it. That being said, some of the stuff is accessible, and especially that text, and it's this fascinating reflection on basically like looking at the arc of civilization as it reaches a certain like spiritual drain as you've kind of gone from the post-Catholic world in the West to that period of the teens and 20s. I forget exactly the date when it's written. And the way that sort of, what do the structures of society look like as they shift, right? I mean, it has a very apocalyptic tone to it. And he, sort of sees it as a certain exhaustion. Now, he thinks of it as an exhaustion of the humanist impulse. But he recognizes that's also actually the humanist impulse is this post-Christian impulse, right? Because humanism inherits in the Renaissance from a kind of Christianity that's being pushed aside. And so, although there was a certain kind of initial flowering that takes place early on, because it's sort of the exuberance of being free. It's like the person who walks away from their state of life, like they are exuberant, and you walk away from Christianity, you're exuberant at first, and then you move toward the kind of decadence, and he kind of traces it. And it's an interesting side eye to some of the same stuff that you're getting in like Maritain's The Twilight of Civilization. Or that opening essay in Science and Wisdom. Right. So you get but the point of this is to say, it's like, there are many thinkers of this period. I'm sure, you probably could cite other intellectual genealogies of this. It's not just the fin de siècle at the end of the 19th century. It's the experience of everything from like 1900 to even just 30 before the Second World War, let alone the end of the Second World War.
It is interesting that the historiography does attract, as you say, it attracts attention, and history is an art. It's not a capricious art, however, so one can recognize patterns. And so you see, this is where like the historian Sorokin that talks about different phases you can identify. There was recently that book that is not quite as serious, but it's not a joke. What's it called? Like The Four Corners or something that all like the conservatives got excited about. It's like patterns in history. You would know what I'm talking about.
I might, maybe we did, yeah.
But this has been going on for a long time to recognize you can see certain patterns that can lead you to give a certain diagnostic or at least a location, almost like an Apple location pin. We are here. And yet, with regard to Maritain and Garrigou, I remember a few years ago, you and I were discussing a book you and I have read by Maritain numerous times. And in a way, it's his last book, in a way, The Peasant of Garonne. Mm-hmm. And I think you described it very well. You said, yeah, I like that, but that's kind of Maritain's and another thing book. But what you see with Maritain, how do we, because there he's not off the rails in that book. In fact, if anything, he wants to be on the rails as fully and completely as, when you look at the Garrigous died, they had their falling out. They had kind of a reconciliation. They were always friends. They always loved the truth. Maritain continued. And then you have the Peasant of Garonne. How would you, as truly a Maritain expert, contextualize that within what we've been talking about? And I ask that sincerely for myself.
Now, the contextualization is going to be, because I associate 68 probably with the translation. It might be 67 because it's right after the Second Vatican Council. But it's at least I would say the actual hermeneutic for that, even though it's not historically connected, is the Credo of the People of God. right, that's right, that Journet is basically asked by Paul VI, St. Paul VI asks him to write a credo because he asks Journet, how's the state of the church? And the upheaval of the late 60s, right? Journet's like, what are you talking about? No one's listening to you.
How are things going?
Yeah.
Badly, Holy
That's
Father.
it, exactly. That's almost how the story goes. And then they had Maritain write the credo. And so you have this sense where Maritain sort of looks back over his whole life and when he looks at what's going on just in the culture and even among the church, he just all the principles are still present, and he just sets forth like, here the same errors that I wrote about in Anti-Moderne and the Three Reformers. Right, because there's a sense which he just pile drives all of a sudden against Descartes in one section, right? The idiosophy, because he has this line where it's kind of like, he kind of like goes through like Hegel and others, and even like Hume, like he kind of like sort of like, he doesn't say it this way, but it comes across. This is how I feel in my remembrance of it. Like it's as though he says, I could have a beer with Hume, but he's like, but the one I'm going to come after, like the jugular I'm going to come after, is Descartes. And then you see all the main themes, kind of whatever we might say about the speculative history, because of course Descartes is part of a kind of broader problematic movement in the intellectual mind of the West at the time, right? So he's great philosophers are not great philosophers at all. They're basically speaking the zeitgeist at the time, and then they get to ride that wave throughout history as being necessary to read, as kind of codifying. It's like Maritain said about Hegel. It's better to have Hegel say Hegelian ideas than to have them floating around in the culture and no one's ever articulated them. And so he just gets kind of right back to that level of principles of criticism of issues in the modern mind, et cetera, in view of the present issues of the 60s, right? But yeah, I see it as a certain statement of continuity, and that's how he was read, obviously, right? That's the text that some people look at and they're kind of startled by, and they see it as, oh God, he got old and became a reactionary, is how they react, right? The more progressive wing that he would have been associated with, because he wrote for publications that today would be considered progressively Catholic. They were perhaps a little bit less so at the time, but still they would be less conservative than others. But yeah, that's that's how I just sort of approach it. So in a way, that's why I ally it, even though there's that difference of time with the credo, is because it's in that same vein of, wait a second. We still actually, reality is reality, right?
Amen.
Being is being and non-being is non-being. Thank you very much.
And this is where, back to what we began with, because the Peasant of Garonne kind of shows that Maritain regarded his project as fundamentally unified, which means that even if the early Garrigou and the early Maritain were united, and even though it seemed like on some issues Garrigou and Maritain were divided later on, that still, the underlying element was still a fundamental unity on the level of first principles.
Yeah.
Maritain never forsook that. Garrigou obviously never forsook that. No one ever thought he did.
But
even it just shows Maritain never did either, as he reflects back in his life.
Yeah. And I'll leave that. It's more of a Garrigou comment, so I'll leave it. It's a good comment, but it's one that, like, it's just very fast. It's like you see him always returning to those principles, right? You know what I mean? And some people see it as a certain simplicity, and it's like, no. He talked about it as a young man, and as you very well pointed out years ago. I mean, I think you probably were the one who made it very clear to me, even if I had run into it before. The comment that he makes, you probably introduced it to me in that essay on the sense of mystery, where he remarks about, as a young man, he was tempted. He was, bright, going to be a medical student. He was very tempted toward sort of knowing all the conclusions that you can draw, right? And he had a certain kind of purification of mind that he, am I correct? He attributes it even to Our Lady.
Yes. Yeah.
To want to heed first and above all those great principles that dominate, those great peaks on the mountain, as he says about Gardet, that dominate all the other questions, that suffuse reality. So it's not just simplicity.
Sublimity.
Yeah. Now at principles, we got a little bit more time here, because you're like, I want to land it, but I said I got an hour with you. So, because I want to see your thought on this. We've talked about this, of course, privately. So there's a Christian philosophy debate. People can go, of course, and look into this. The late 20s and the 30s debate in the Francophone world over, is there such a thing as a Christian philosophy? Various positions are sort of staked out usually. I mean, there are certain ones that are purely secular that just reject the possibility, right? Because of something that would be along the lines of the kind of immanent resources of reason kind of set the boundaries of what you can even call philosophy. And then there's a certain scholastic way of talking too about the division of philosophy and theology, which makes a very clear case cut between the task of philosophizing by the light and perspicuity, objectival perspicuity. I think you and I at least know what we mean by that. Others can come into the esoteric chamber with us and come to learn these things of the intellect and its data, and then faith, from those premises which are revealed and under the supernatural light of faith, of supernatural faith, but discursively considering the data does theology. And then there's a certain middle position, most often attached, of course, to Gilles Salm, because he almost turns philosophy into only the handmaid of theology, especially by the end of his career, where he really, because of the historical reasons of like looking at Thomas's texts and the deployment of philosophy in theology, he takes some pretty strong positions about the subordination of philosophy to theology, at least in Thomism. And then Maritain strikes a certain middle position regarding the objective and subjective dependencies of philosophy upon theology. And I remember being struck that Garrigou himself speaks of an intrinsically Christian philosophy to the point that he shocks. I think if we were talking, isn't it one of the later masters general? Isn't that Fernandez?
Well, yeah, that's right. Fernandez asked him that. He kind of objects in the. This is from your Philosophizing in Faith volume. Yeah, they have all the big boys in the Dominican order ask him questions after this paper.
Yeah,
including Fernandez, who's a master philosopher. Yeah,
there's a subject, there's a section heading that I gave you in the thing that I think it shocked me when I translated it. Christian philosophy is not only Christian negatively, so in the sense that it's not opposed to revealed truth, right? That because he'll talk like this, and he even does in a certain sense in this essay, but the younger Garrigou will talk about how faith is a kind of negative norm for philosophy. It's a kind of a normal thing to say, I think, in the jargon of the time. But in this essay, he's like, but it can't be negative without also providing some direction, is basically the argument he makes in the essay. So it's not only Christian negatively and by reason of the knowing subject. I'm a Christian philosopher, but not Christian philosophy. But rather is Christian positively and in itself. And I thought, wow, he went there. So what do you think, Father?
I know that you and I have talked about this many times. I'm much more comfortable in the very clear, formalized, disciplinary layout of the scholastic. Here's what philosophy does. Here's its primary objectivity. Here's what material objects it can extend to. And here's Sacra Doctrina. Faith. But I think we have to say Garrigou is right. I don't like the language like that. I think it confuses a lot of people. I think when Garrigou says it, he knows what he's talking about. When we hear it.
Yeah. That's why those questions happen.
Yes, exactly. So Garrigou is right in what he means. The language, I still get nervous because I know if people read that, they're hearing something else than what Garrigou is saying. But to cite my Maritain tactics of rhetoric, sometimes spicy, provocative things catch people's attention.
That's
and
right.
If that attracts people to read Garrigou, fine, and learn the truth. And
That's it. As long as it encourages people to reread with fresh eyes, those positions, great. If this encourages a dissertation, which is like how Blondel and Garrigou agreed, I've failed.
Yes, no, neither of them would agree with that dissertation topic. And yet it is true that in the concrete, both as a discipline and as someone who has a discipline itself, what Garrigou points to has to be true. Now, you came to this much earlier on, though, than I, because I've always been, formalized. When you and I have a conversation, I'm ready to jump up to, okay, here's the principles, here's the science, here's the different objects, and I start doing this. You feel you were willing to consider and to look at this earlier, I think, than I was.
I tend to feel, it's probably my initial philosophical training, I tend to think of, okay, well, wait, what's the context where this principle emerges?
Yeah.
Right. There's a separate conversation Father and I sometimes have about like how it is through in theology, truths about the Trinity are revealed. I mean, first, it's genetically true. It's kind of Christology and the Trinitarian theology kind of grow up next to each other. And there's a certain sense in which obviously it's sort of through Christ's sacred humanity that we know, it's through Christ, the incarnate word, I should say, that we know of the truths of the Trinity. But of course, in the order of explanation, it's not as though the missions of the persons explain the Trinity. I mean, you're going to end up in some weird German mysticism if you do that. And so so not that you're insensitive to it, because we had to talk about it, methodologically, are there implications or whatever, maybe, yes or no. I mean, that's an open kind of debate, right? You and I both agree on that you got to start with the Trinity first. It's the keystone of this whole structure, right? But your initial place is, okay, so let's do that. Yeah. And that's like,
And you
it's
want to, whoa, hold on. How did we get here? I'm like, but it doesn't matter because we're here. That's over exaggerated, but that is a little
yeah.
like what it is. Yeah.
Father's world is just ladders underneath him that are just kicked out. They're just ladders strewn underneath him. No, and they're not. This is a very different interview because although I've got geniality with a lot of the interviewers or interviewees that I've had on here, we do so much other parallel work. Yeah, we have that kind of provoking not to write the dissertation that would be problematic and hopefully failed because it wouldn't be right. For whatever one can see a similarity, obviously, between the concerns of Blondel about Christian, like rationalism, fine. Garrigou even admits that. Still, the dissertation that makes them the same. Got to fail that dissertation because it just doesn't work. That's square in a circle. But we said then, if it provokes a certain desire to read Garrigou, on this or other things, it would be good. And to read Maritain with a new light, to see the presence of Garrigou in that same conversation space that is Garrigou's conversation space, great. Along those lines, then, of final provocation, maybe doesn't have to be spicy because that's my job. What's your final word you want to leave our listeners with then?
I think, and I've said this before, but I mean it sincerely, and anything worth saying once is worth saying several times if it's really worth saying once, and that's this: the world doesn't need Garrigou-Lagrange and Jacques Maritain. They were men of the late 19th, early 20th, mid-20th century. What we need are new Garrigous and new Maritains, who, like Garrigou and Maritain, assimilate in prayer, in contemplation, in love, and an amata notitia, a loving knowledge, a loving awareness of the first principles and supremely of God, the principle of all principles, and then does what they did in our time with the questions and the needs and the contingencies of our modern period. So what you, at least I'll speak for myself, I would assume you'd agree fully. I'm not about a recovery or a rediscovery or a new reception of Maritain or Garrigou. You work the reason I appreciate all your work on the Garrigou stuff, the reason I worked with Emmaus to get the Manser translated by the wonderful Michael Miller, who's wonderful in German, is not because we want Garrigou and Maritain and Manser to be the thing, but because there's something in there that we need now that you can remove or abstract from them and apply to now. And so I would say go to Jacques and go to Garrigou and ite ad Tomam, go to Thomas, but not because of any of them, but because of the truth. And please God, new Maritains, new Garrigous, new Mansers are raised up for today. It's my sincere earnest, and that's a calling from the Lord, I think, to a lot of people. I hope, I pray.
Yeah, well, I'll leave it there.
Respond.
Those are good words. So thank you, Father Cajetan Cuddy, for being here with us today. It was a real pleasure.
It's way too much fun, and so no, I have great affection for you and the AMA. It was a privilege to speak at the conference a couple years ago, and who knows, I might, if we have this much fun, if AMA people have this much fun, you and Jim Jacobs and others, I might just have to start coming regularly.
I'm saying it's a great group. That's a great group. We're not here to pitch it to you, but the AMA is the only sponsor for the AMA podcast. Consider us. We're a great group of both humans and Catholics. But in any event, I will, as promised, close us out. And this has been Maritain Musings, a production of the American Maritain Association, trying to bring you at least some knowledge of the works and thought of Maritain, today, online through experts and friends that we have in our circle. And I'd like to also, of course, then thank you, our listeners and viewers, as well as our student assistant, Hunter Olson, who helps with the editing of this podcast. So thank you very much.